Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Corombos of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. So there I was minding my own business, trying to find topics for the Thursday edition. And then I get an email from Jim Garrity saying, let's do all OJ today. And I'm thinking, well, why? And then I'm like, well, there must be a reason. So I Google it, and yes, O.J. Simpson is dead at the age of 76 after a cancer battle that I was certainly not aware of. And so we're going to talk about O.J. today in a number of ways. One of the reasons we're going to organize it this way is because every American of a certain age, I would say probably late 30s and older, knows of O.J. in a significant way. If you're that young, it's probably just the sensational trial and the downward spiraling life that O.J. had after that. If you're of our age and certainly older, you've got, of course, his incredibly popular football and media and acting career. And so, Jim, I remember about a handful of years, maybe a decade after the murder trial with O.J., I had interns who had not understood who O.J. was before the trial. And then about a decade after that, after O.J. had been paroled from when he actually was sent to prison for stealing his stuff back by force, by guns, if that even was his stuff, he got paroled. And I said, oh, I bet the interns will just know him as the murderer. They didn't know who he was at all because he had been incarcerated for the last several years and he was off the radar. So any initial quick thoughts here before we get to why he was so beloved in the first place?
Well, I was going to say that I think because for anybody who's like, I hate that guy, killed two people, I don't care what the jury said, why are Jim and Greg spending, the podcast talking about him today? I think you can make an argument that O.J. Simpson was one of the most influential and significant Americans in the last quarter of the 20th century, mostly for the negative, and most notably for what his alleged murder that overwhelming majorities eventually came to believe that he did, that he committed, the trial, the outcoming of the trial, its effect on race relations, its effect on how the media, how we think about celebrities, all just had enormous. It was a turning point. It was a huge change there in 1994. Things were never the same, and so there's some part of me that's like, I've already seen the bitter jokes. Well, he finally found the real killer and got him. Or even some jokes about cancer. If people who are fighting cancer, you just don't want to make those kind of jokes. But look, a guy who just utterly dominated the national conversation for the better part of the 1990s, and a lot of people did not like what they saw. So we'll just jump into that in just a second. But just like, look, I mean this when I say it in every possible form. A terribly consequential life that has come to an end today.
We'll talk about all of it, but let's start with why O.J. was a prominent figure in the first place. He was a phenomenal football player, and I think most people are aware of that, but for those who don't know, he was a star running back in high school, went to University of Southern California, 1968 Heisman Trophy winner, one of the most dominant margins of victory for that award ever. Draft pick of the Buffalo Bills, was a phenomenal running back, the first ever running back to rush for 2,000 yards in a season, and still the only one to do it in 14 games. Unfortunately, had a really good last game of the season against the Jets to get over the top there.
Oh, that comes up in all the documentaries. That's right. It's one of the rare cases like just fast forward to the murders, okay?
And so bad knees, eventually ended his career after I think it was 11 or 12 seasons. NFL Hall of Famer, was briefly part of the team on Monday Night Football. He's ubiquitous on TV ads, especially for Hertz. Even while he was still playing, he got into movies like The Towering Inferno, and folks our age know him best as Nordberg from Naked Gun and Naked Gun 2.5. He was also part of the NBC pregame show team, and he might have still been on that team when he got accused of murder. So one of the memes that's been going around social media a long time now for the last few years has been from the late 70s, where Howard Cosell is flanked by O.J. Simpson and Bruce Jenner. And the meme is, folks, this is Howard Cosell. I've seen the future and you won't believe this stuff. And so, Jim, he was everywhere, even in the pre-internet, pre-cable era. This is the guy who was everywhere. And by and large, just about everybody loved the guy.
Yeah, and I think back, the summer of the murder and the initial mentioning of O.J. Simpson as a suspect. I was working at Baxter Healthcare, a warehouse out in central New Jersey, loading up trucks. the response say, hey, did you hear O.J. Simpson's wife got murdered? And some other guy, yeah, they're saying, the police said they want to talk. What? There was just utter disbelief, this utter ridiculousness. And I got to emphasize for our listeners of today, look, this is before Phil Spector. This is before Robert Blake, Oscar Pistorius. I went looking through all the celebrities who've been accused of killing someone. Aaron Hernandez, the former tight end of the New England Patriots. Alec Baldwin, obviously an accidental shooting on that set. It was before TMZ. There were paparazzi, but it was not quite as big and ubiquitous as it is today. Certainly there was no internet. People didn't have their cell phone cameras. So the image of celebrities was much more guarded and stage managed and perfected to project the happy image that these celebrities and their managers and their agents and everybody else wanted to project. So the idea that somebody who was rich and famous, as O.J. Simpson was, could ever be the kind of person who'd commit a murder, that was just unthinkable. No, murder, criminals, poor people do that. Rich celebrities, they're happy with their lives. There's no reason for them to do something like that. As we'll get to, public opinion would soon shift, but at the initial moment, there was just this disbelief because everybody loved him. And one of the other, truly bizarre, I don't know if we call it ironies, as you said, probably his work with NBC Sports as a football commentator was starting to decline as the 90s advanced. But he'd still done the Naked Gun movies, and I think there were like three of them in a relatively short sequence of time. And Nordberg was a cop, and Nordberg was always having terrible accidents happen to him. And if you eventually came to saw O.J. Simpson as a double murderer, well, then you just watched those movies and felt even better every time O.J. Simpson would fall down the stairs and crash out to the basketball field or some other trouble. You take that, Nordberg. You have that coming to you. And it was just, but he was this, initially a beloved figure. And this idea, that's one of the things that made the prospect of him. And the idea, things that we eventually would hear in a 911 call, and this idea of him being an abusive husband was completely separate from the public image and perception of him up until the trial. And I think that's a hard lesson that our celebrity, we always knew there was this stage-managed, blow-dried, airbrushed image of celebrities, but I think the degree to which the image of O.J. Simpson and the reality of O.J. Simpson were such a stark contrast. It was a hard lesson for America in the mid-1990s.
I think you're absolutely right. I think virtually all Americans, at least initially, found it absolutely impossible and implausible that O.J. Simpson could seriously be considered as the murderer in this case. And so we'll talk about the trial in just a second and later on the larger legacy of the whole O.J. saga. But first, I got to tell you about the great deals over at 4patriots.com/martini. You can still get good deals for a limited time on the Patriot Pure line items like UV phone sanitizer, the UV wand, the sanitation solution machine, and the disinfecting power bank. But the big news, as we've been talking about the last couple weeks, over at 4patriots.com/martini, the return of the deluxe 3-month survival food kits. They were sold out for more than a year due to huge popular demand. You just don't know when an emergency is going to strike. So be prepared with the deluxe 3-month survival food kit. It gives you about 1,500 calories per person per day. Comes in disaster-resistant packaging, 100% satisfaction guaranteed. You can stash food away and be confident that when a disaster strikes, you and your family will be ready. Go to 4patriots.com/martini to get the deluxe 3-month survival food kit and the peace of mind you deserve. Plus, get free shipping on orders over $97. That's the number 4, patriots.com/martini. That's 4patriots.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our second part of the O.J. story, and that's when he went from beloved celebrity and former athlete, Hall of Fame athlete, and then he became an accused murderer. It was June of 1994, so believe it or not, 30 years ago, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, had been killed in brutal fashion, along with her friend Ron Goldman, who had apparently been delivering sunglasses that she had left at the restaurant where he worked the same night as the murder. And so within a few days, I think it was about a week later, O.J. Simpson was formally charged. We got the completely surreal chase across Los Angeles in the white Ford Bronco. And then shortly after that, he assembled the dream team of Robert Shapiro, F. Lee Bailey. Then Johnny Cochran got on board and really became kind of the lead face of the team. Barry Scheck, I think Dershowitz was briefly involved somewhere. I mean, basically every high-priced famous attorney you can imagine. And it's one of the original trials, I think, that certainly got wall-to-wall coverage on cable news, which at that time was basically CNN. Judge Lance Ito allowed cameras in the courtroom, largely turned it into a circus. It seemed like he was playing to the cameras a lot. Hollywood loved the trial. Jay Leno had the dancing Itos and kind of turned it into a massive circus. You also had Saturday Night Live doing a lot of commentary on it. Norm Macdonald was brutally anti-OJ, of course, and this played out over a long time. He was arraigned in the summer of 94. It wasn't until October of 95 that we had a verdict. The trial played out over almost entirely of 1995 until that point. And then even after the verdict, which he was acquitted on, you got moments like this on Saturday Night Live with Tim Meadows playing OJ and Daryl Hammond playing our old friend Bob Costas.
By the way, OJ, we're all sorry about your 1.5-year incarceration.
Hey, well, thanks, Bob. And by the way, if anyone knows or has any information about the identity of the murderer, just call 1-600-MURDERER. It's important that we find the murderer. After all, if I didn't do it, that means someone else did. All right, well, the teams are almost ready to take the field, and Bob, they look pretty pumped. Right now, I got Bills coach Marv Levy here. Marv, you guys are 3-1. You must be feeling real good right now.
Sure, we feel okay.
Now, Marv, last time you guys played the Jets, you really killed them. I mean, you guys really went for the jugular.
And that's just how brazen and aggressive the comedy was at that time. And so, Jim, it dominated our culture for the better part of a year. And even after that, we had the civil trial where he was found liable. I mean, OJ for the second half of the 90s was just this ubiquitous figure in a completely different way than he had been before.
Yeah, and I was thinking about what other news stories have dominated the news for a comparable period. And I think you can come up with COVID. We cover presidential campaigns intensely. So I think, you could say really the last two, like it's not like Trump has lacked for coverage over the last two presidential cycles. But I think, when the people call it the trial of the century right next to the Lindbergh baby, I think it's a fair comparison. And I think it had a huge impact on how it was a ratings bonanza. It was, first and foremost, it was the lead item on the news nationally just about every day on the front page, whether what was going on in the trial was a big deal or a small deal, and just relentless. And just, I remember hearing from someone who had been a major correspondent at one of the major papers, and they were getting huge attention for their coverage of the trial. And somebody said, how difficult is this? And he says, it's the easiest job ever. You're just in the courtroom and you write down what happens. And it was kind of this interesting thing to which there was not investigative journalism. It was just, saying this is what has happened in the trial. In theory, events like this can be good for the public to get a better understanding of how the criminal trial process works, the arguments, the rules for evidence and things like that. But I think your characterization of it as circus is very much an accurate one. And I think if you look back on it, in the end, this is about the brutal murder of two people. Now, I think OJ did it. I've spoken to people who I don't think of as dumb who've made the argument that actually who believe it was OJ's son. And that's the reason OJ could not really put forth a easy defense. That was, in the way he was attempting to not get convicted, but also not be able to point in the direction of the person who actually did, which is an interesting theory. I don't know if I haven't studied the evidence well enough to evaluate that. But when you think about the fact that this was about a brutal murder of two people who didn't deserve that, and it turns into the dancing Itos and the Jay Leno show. I liked Jay Leno, but I think you look back on that and you really cringe, and you really begin to realize that this isn't the sort of thing we're supposed to laugh about. This isn't the sort of thing we're supposed to find entertaining. Now, I do think it's very interesting that decades later, and maybe I'm foreshadowing that we'll talk in our next one. There was both an FX drama series about the trial with some big name actors playing everyone. And then ESPN did a really fascinating 5-part series, OJ Made in America, which I think was really interesting for how much it told the life story of OJ Simpson, but it also was not afraid to step back and look at race relations in Los Angeles in the early 1990s leading up to the trial, which I think was a very big factor. And once I watched that, I feel like I had a much better understanding of, oh my goodness, how could the jury, come to this conclusion? How could they have so much suspicion of the Los Angeles Police Department? Well, the LAPD, not just after Rodney King, but in a variety of other cases that were not national news, had done a lot to pour fuel on the fires of distrust among the African-American community. And when they had some real slap on the wrist penalties for people who had straight up murdered African-American, in one case it was a teenage girl, of a Korean store owner, just pulled out a gun and shot him after suspecting them for shoplifting. Now, shoplifting is bad, but you're not supposed to get shot in the head over it. And then the person got community service. And there was not a full-on riot, but there was this like violent commotion immediately outside the courtroom. And you look at that and you're like, okay, I can't say rioting is justified. But when the African-American community of Los Angeles felt that strongly that the justice system was sending this consistent signal, these lives mean nothing. There is no real consequence to taking the life of an African-American. You begin to understand that anger. You may not justify it, but you begin to at least understand why that community felt the way it did and why Los Angeles felt like such a powder keg in the mid-1990s. I believe it was John Travolta playing Robert Shapiro. His entire effort to try to get an acquittal or to try to cut a deal is that he was afraid that if O.J. Simpson was convicted that there would be riots. And it would be like the L.A. riots after Rodney King all over again. All of this goes into this context, and we'll talk a bit more about the legacy in a few minutes, but just kind of interesting, like just real revelation of how the intersection of fame, race, sex, power, all of that intersected in this trial. And I think taught some very ugly lessons about the harsh realities of that. You can argue Los Angeles probably has it worse than many other parts of the country. And I would argue, I think it was, comedian Robert Wool who once said, with a lot of dark humor around OJ, we played a bit from SNL a moment ago. He said something like, I wasn't surprised they didn't convict OJ. These guys, prosecutors in LA, they haven't nailed anybody since Manson. And the sheer sense of how many, celebrities have managed to escape serious consequences when they commit crimes and things like that. And who knows, probably being a celebrity gives you a sense of entitlement and gives you a sense that the rules don't apply to you and maybe the laws don't apply to you. But I think O.J. Simpson really, very little has riveted the country that way. And I think people were kind of horrified, one, when they heard those 911 tapes and they realized this guy who they'd loved for so long was a monster, was a violent, dangerous man who was threatening Nicole Simpson. And it was just kind of a revelation that of how much what you get told and the image that you are sold by Hollywood very often is the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, and Jim, you mentioned Robert Shapiro there. I mentioned some of the Dream Team. Another one, of course, was OJ's friend, who was also an attorney named Robert Kardashian. And I don't know if we would have had the whole popular saga of that family over the last 30 years, if not for all this whole situation with OJ. And then in terms of the actual details of the trial, I think perhaps one of the most sensational ones was when Christopher Darden, one of the prosecutors, had OJ try on the glove that they had found as part of their investigation. And they had him put on latex gloves first and then the glove over that. The defense team, as we found out in the ESPN documentary, which is excellent, had expected this was coming, so they specifically told OJ not to take his anti-arthritis medication, so his fingers would swell up, and so therefore the glove would not fit. And another point I remember from that documentary is that they took the jury to OJ's house, and before they brought the jury over there, the defense team changed a lot of the pictures they had there. So it wasn't OJ with a bunch of his white friends or Hispanic friends. It was all black people he was hanging out with because that was a predominant percentage of the jury. And then, of course, the most salacious and sordid part of this was when they played the race card because they found those tapes of Mark Furman, the LAPD detective, who was very much on the case, had been giving some advice to some screenwriter or something, and some very racist language came out during those recordings. So in terms of the guts of the trial, I think those were kind of the moments that really stand out, and I'm not sure it was the greatest thing for jurisprudence in this country.
No, and I think you heard, this is when the term jury nullification came forward. Now, I do wonder if Americans who were horrified at the thought of jury nullification feel the same way today about, let's say it's the state prosecuting your favorite presidential candidate. The number of people say, oh, no, my guy would never do anything that bad. I do wonder if that is quite as... The idea of the government targeting someone over a political agenda or over a particular... beef or some sort of signal, I think it was comedian Robert Pollack who was mocking the conspiracy theories that the police were out to get OJ. And he talked about all the sheer number of police personnel who would have to fake evidence and how they'd have to be told with no warning, hey, we're going to plant the blood at OJ's place. You in? And the guy's like, well, I could get fired. I'd be a disgrace to my profession. I'd be, violating my oath. I'd probably go to jail. But to get OJ, it's just too good. I have to do it. the idea, there's a great deal of good reason for skepticism about this conspiratorial, but they sold it to the jury, and the jury believed it, in part because of how much distrust and mistrust existed between African Americans and the LAPD, which did not happen in a vacuum. That it had happened, no doubt, because of some unforgivable, unjustifiable acts on the part of the LAPD that I think you could argue they're still dealing with today. That it had never gone through that race relations in Los Angeles have never run smoothly.
Yeah, and they didn't want LA Riots Part 2 just 2 years after the ones prior to that. All right, Jim, as we wrap up here with the legacy of O.J. Simpson, of course, he was acquitted, as we've said. He was found liable in the civil trial, but there's all sorts of kind of financial chicanery you can do that O.J. largely used to avoid paying the Goldmans a lot. I don't know what the actual breakdown ended up being, but he seemed like he dodged it for the most part. He, of course, went on to talk about his search for the real killer. We talked about his being arrested and convicted in Nevada for armed robbery, eventually paroled. And so when you look at the last 30 years on this, we've talked about race relations a couple of times, but I think there had been a considerable amount of progress, not steady. There's always been some setbacks, but pretty steady progress on race relations from the civil rights movement up until the early 90s. And this was really kind of a kick in the gut. And obviously I think it's been worse in the last number of years here as well. We talked about the legal profession, and then in terms of just, how society looks at OJ, looks at this whole saga. Did we learn the right lessons from all of this? And without making a pun of it, I think the jury's still out.
Yeah. I mean, when OJ was sentenced for what he claimed was just trying to recover his own property, he was sentenced the sentence was up to 33 years. I believe he ended up serving close to 2 decades, a considerable amount of time. And I think, if you, in the OJ Made in America documentary, they make the argument that, as one, I think one of the lawyers do something like the phrase, well, we beat him in the 4 quarters, but they beat us in the 5th quarter, which is to say that they couldn't get him on murder, but when he got convicted on a separate crime, the criminal justice system threw the book at him and threw the most harsh sentence they could, in lieu of the conviction he should have had for murdering Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. And that, so some people look at that and say, okay, well, that's justice. There's some people who might say, that's not really exactly the way it's supposed to work. I do find it interesting is that once OJ got himself in trouble again, I do notice that second trial did not have the racially charged excitement and debate and all that kind of stuff. And I do wonder if people, all across the spectrum of American opinion were like, oh, maybe this OJ Simpson fellow is not a good guy. Maybe Norm Macdonald was right, that he's a bad man, and that, and I think one of the most intriguing things since the news broke, I went and found in 2016, the Wall Street Journal and NBC News conducted a poll. I imagine this is probably after the time of the documentary series. And they found that at that time, 2016, 69% of Americans believe O.J. Simpson did commit the murders, and just 7% believed that he didn't. 20% said they weren't sure. So the idea that the O.J. Simpson didn't do it crowd had really shrunk as time went by. And for those wondering about the racial breakdown, 70% of whites believe Simpson committed the murders, 5% said he did not, 18% weren't sure. Among African Americans, who were his most staunch defenders back in the mid-90s, 44% thought Mr. Simpson committed the crimes, 22% believed he did not, and 27% weren't sure. Among Hispanics, 76% believed Simpson committed the crimes, 5% he didn't, 22% unsure. So the idea that O.J. Simpson was framed for the murders had really become a small minority perspective over time. And I do kind of wonder if you look at every racial and criminal controversy that has come down the pike over the last couple of decades, over time, do people become less invested? It's like they staked their claim, they planted their flag. My guy totally didn't do it, or that guy totally did it. Over time, do people begin to look at it a little more, dare I say, rationally, a little more less emotionally invested in it? And I think what we saw with O.J. Simpson was, and also I believe that last part of O.J.'s Made in America looks at his life after the trial, and it was a salacious, horrific, dare I say, hellish, vision. He was trying to do a series of prank videos, and you got juiced, And the idea that O.J. Simpson would jump out and scare people. Let me tell you, somebody jumps out of the bushes and you see O.J. Simpson, you're going to feel really generally scared. That will, a man who, he escaped being imprisoned for committing 2 murders, but who was a broken man in almost every conceivable form, and who was running on notoriety, and who was cashing in on it. His only real source of income was autographs and signing memorabilia and things like that from the number of people who... There was still a fascination with him. There were still a lot of people who wanted a signed O.J. Simpson jersey or football card or things like that. The degree to which O.J. Simpson came from very modest beginnings, catapulted to the apex of fame and fortune and celebrity and all the good things in life, no doubt probably enhanced that sense of I am invincible, I am Adonis, I am above the law, I am above the rules, I can do whatever I want. A long history of abusive behavior that really did not carry any severe consequences. 1994, he indulges that impulse, ends 2 lives, and things are never the same. And unfortunately, he and his legal team were willing to play the race card from the bottom of the deck, as one of his lawyers later put it, and divide the country, play up on what were, in the end, probably justifiable suspicion of the LAPD. But then to get off from, the thing that I keep coming back to is let's say you really distrust the LAPD. Let's assume you really, think that they're a bunch of crooks and they, manufacture evidence and all that stuff. At the end of the day, it's not like there's anybody else who was ever really a strong suspect for committing these murders. And I just can't imagine if you're a jury member, if you'd say, well, I'm going to let this guy who stabbed 2 people to death, I'm going to let him walk the streets. That'll show you, LAPD. Now we've got murderers walking free. Take that. Yeah, okay. I don't think that really makes moral or logical sense from my perspective. But if I remember correctly, there was a Weekly Standard magazine cover that was entitled, that just the headline was "How He Still Haunts Us," and I do think that O.J. Simpson became this figure who haunted America as just a sign of how terribly things can go wrong, and how twisted our system of justice, our perception of race, our perception of celebrity, fame, power, and money, how that can twist everything inside out and deny justice that, maybe the families of the victims feel a sense of satisfaction today. I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference to them. A lot of time has passed, but those of us who lived through it, there's always going to have a flood of memories coming back when we hear that infamous name.
Keep in mind, timeline-wise, that the Clinton Lewinsky scandal pretty much followed on the heels of the civil trial verdicts. So we had salacious scandal going nonstop for quite a long time there. But yeah, after the verdict, he basically fell into a life of debauchery. In addition to going to prison for the armed robbery, there, of course, was the book, If I Did It, Here's How It Happened, and stuff like that. So, the point of this is not just a trip down memory lane, and I hope we've made that clear. For our younger listeners, is to explain who this guy was and why this was such a landmark event in our history, and also to point out that this isn't isolated in 1994-95. The ripple effect from this, I think, in a number of different ways, illegally, culturally, race relations-wise, still continues today. So a lot to talk about there. But Jim, back to, I assume, our normal fare tomorrow, barring other breaking news like this. See you tomorrow.
We'll see which other figure from the 90s passes away in the next 24 hours. But no, look, we don't, extensive 90s discussions isn't what we set out to do this podcast on, but every now and then the opportunity comes along. We just feel a need to do that. So,
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corumbus of Radio America. Thank you for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, and tell your friends and neighbors to do so as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Thursday, and join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.